This lecture from Module 9 will focus on the Great Migration. We'll look at the dates, the numbers, the causes, and some outcomes of these migrations. In 1890, African Americans were approximately 8.4% of the nation's population. 90% of all blacks still lived in the South. By 1980, the percentage had declined to approximately 7.3%, but only 50% of all African Americans lived in the South. This shift in the location of the black population was the result of the great migrations of the 20th century. From 1915 until the 1960s, millions of African Americans left their homes in the South, headed for destinations in the Northeast, the Midwest, and the Far West. In this lecture, I'll examine the motivations, the scope, and the methods involved in these migrations, as well as the receptions that the migrants met, and how, individually and collectively, the migrants changed or were changed by their experiences. As I mentioned earlier, in the late 19th century, about 90% of all African Americans still lived in the South, where they worked the region's cotton, tobacco, and sugarcane farms and plantations. Only 1/4 of Southern blacks owned the land they farmed. Most were locked into sharecropping or tenancy agreements with white landowners. They had little to say about what or how they would produce these crops, or even, in some cases, which family members would be employed. Although some post-emancipation freed black families preferred to restrict female labor in order to limit contact between black women and abusive white landowners or managers, poverty forced many families to put every available hand in the fields in hopes of making a profit and buying their own land. The result was that many black families shared authority within their households with their landlords, who required all family members to work in the field. Landlords influenced these work relations by controlling the furnish, or the equipment, seeds, housing, and even food that a family needed to survive. The acreage they farmed, black families farmed, was small, and lien holders, and we're referring to the crop lien system. You can find more information about this on page 285. Lien holders often required the farmer to put most of his fields into a cash crop. Families had to purchase food rather than grow their own. Diets were sparse, monotonous, and dull. Most rural black families, however, were two-parent households, but they were likely to include older relatives, or what we could call collateral kin, siblings, nieces, nephews, cousins. But rural black families did have some degree of mobility within this agricultural system. White labor agents recruited farm workers for planters throughout the South. Other blacks moved because of white capping or the practice of forcing black landowners off their land with threats of violence or the use of intimidation. By the late 19th century, Southern blacks, as the resident of Wilmington, North Carolina, noted in Part 2 of The Rise and Fall of Jim Crow, Southern blacks understood what was referred to as their place in society. This place had been created, or the sense of place had been created, in the aftermath of the race riots and the establishment of Jim Crow laws, the intimidation, the lynchings, and even what we can refer to as Negro law, or the unwritten laws that were based on and reinforced black powerlessness, and in effect set boundaries as to what this sense of place would be. Restrictions on voting, poll taxes, literacy tests, property qualifications, grandfather clauses also limited or totally restricted black political activity throughout the rural and the urban South. The Great Migrations of the 20th century significantly altered the populations of the rural and urban South, as well as northern and midwestern cities and towns. Although we'll look at these population shifts more specifically, the Great Migrations were accomplished in what we could see as two major waves. We can distinguish these waves in the numbers of migrants, the locations for leaving the South, and the destinations. The first wave began in about 1915. We can probably see World War I as the bookend for this, the beginning of it, or the motivation for it. Began with the beginning of the First World War in Europe, mainly because the war had the effect of cutting off European migration that was a major source of labor for the northern industries. And this first migration continued until the end of the 1920s. The first wave of the migration continued until the end of the 1930s. The end of the 1920s. Although some maps that we'll see during this lecture will place this first migration within that 1915 to 1930 period. I think I'd like to keep it within the first 2 decades of the 20th century. The second wave of this migration occurred in the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s. By the mid-1960s, over 5 million African Americans had left their homes in the South for destinations in the Northeast, the Midwest, and the Far West. Other rural blacks migrated to southern cities and towns during the same period. The migrations lessened in the last decades of the 20th century because of the Civil Rights Movement, the war in Vietnam, and the energy crisis of the 1970s and 1980s. And by the end of the century, the 20th century, we have what many have described as a reverse migration, as many migrants, or the children of the migrants, who left in the first half of the century returned home to their rural homes, or to their homes rather, not necessarily rural, in the South. What were the causes of this Great Migration? The fundamental causes of the Great Migration were economic, although there were also important social situations that contributed to the movement. These economic causes included poverty, low wages, agricultural difficulties like boll weevil infestations that destroyed cotton crops, drought, floods, all of these agricultural difficulties in the South, coupled with the expansion of northern industry and declines in European immigration during World War I. There was also the image of the North as an economic promised land. This promised land imagery also challenged Jim Crow segregation and political disenfranchisement in the South. Northern newspapers like the Chicago Defender ran articles that encouraged blacks to come north, and many migrants also wrote letters to their relatives stressing the social, political, and economic benefits of their newer, freer lifestyles in the North. However, we can also say that the migrations were a proactive as well as a reactive movement. Migrations were an expression of independence from white authority, a rejection of this sense of place that blacks had in Southern society, place that was inferior and subordinate, and a redefinition of self and citizenship rights and the importance of being able to exercise these rights. Within the South, there were, however, barriers to just even the movement of blacks from one place to the other. And this, of course, is before we consider the idea of the migrations to the North of the Midwest. Since whites controlled credit through sharecropping contracts or tenancy arrangements, it was very difficult for blacks to move away from plantations or farms where they were considered to be a major labor supply, but most importantly, where they owed money. Recruitment agents who were traveling throughout the South trying to encourage blacks to move from one place to another were often slapped with heavy fines or fees, which the Supreme Court in 1900 held as constitutional. They did not see this as a fault. However, the migrations outside of the South created a whole new set of problems. And when we look at this question of what are some of the barriers to the migration and how did Southern whites respond, we have to consider in these responses general attitudes toward blacks in the South. If you look at the case of Southern extremists, people who were very militant about their ideas toward African Americans and who saw them as basically inferior, many of the Southern extremists welcomed the departure of blacks from the South. On the other hand, Southern moderates, a much larger proportion of the Southern population, were willing to make concessions to black workers to keep them from leaving. They passed what they call anti-enticement laws to keep Northern labor agents who were trying to not just entice blacks to move from one farm to another in the South, but entice them to leave altogether and move north to work in the industries. Southern governments passed anti-enticement laws and vagrancy laws to prevent these recruiters from soliciting black workers or to arrest blacks as vagrants and then arrange for their labor to be leased out to white planters. Other blacks were also arrested for violating these sharecropping contracts when they tried to leave the South. Many Southern whites recognized the economic consequences of this widespread migration of the South's principal labor force. One author described the South's black labor supply as its, quote, most valuable asset. And as the turn-of-the-century Harvard historian Albert Bushnell noted, quote, 3/5 of the wealth of the South is produced by the Negro. One white woman also noted in her comments about these migrations, quote, that which a regard for common justice, fair play, human rights could not accomplish, a fear for our bank account is doing. And we are asking, why is the Negro dissatisfied? What can we do to keep him in the South? We can't afford to let him go. He means too much to us financially. He works for little. His upkeep costs us little, for we can house him in any kind of shack and make him pay us well for that. We do not have to be careful of his living conditions. He is good-natured, long-suffering, and if he should happen to give us trouble, we can cope with that, and the law will uphold us in anything we do. Some Southern newspapers, like the Memphis Commercial Appeal, even countered the depiction of the North as the economic promised land with stories or articles or advertisements like you see at the top in this slide. They tried to convince blacks that rather than looking for this promised land, this economic promised land in the North, working in Northern industries, they should consider all that the South had to offer them in terms of support. Now, this is just the top part of this ad. Let me just move on to the bottom part. And you can't really see the information because of the size of this slide, so I'll just have to read the bottom information. The ad goes on to note that the Southern Negro was, quote, sitting on the world and don't know it. According to this writer, quote, 6 to 8 bales of cotton averages a Negro laborer $50 to $75 a month spending money. He can also enjoy chickens, eggs, and fresh vegetables. The seemingly big wages which are offered to him to supply a temporary emergency in northern industrial centers will be largely consumed by the high cost of actual necessities. When he is out of a job and broke, there will be no odd jobs to pick up enough money and to tide him over. The trials and tribulations he may experience on a cotton plantation will seem small when he has joined the army of unemployed that mobilizes from time to time around industrial centers. Southern cotton fields will need the Negro this fall. He is being lured away to conditions which will not improve his scale of living, but will make him sigh for the country, where he can trail the elusive possum, hunt, fish, and picnic in season. Correspondence and discussion is invited from interested citizens, black and white, by And at the very bottom, the organizers of this ad, or promoters of this ad, are referred to as the Commercial Appeals Back to the South Department. So this will give you some idea of how Southern whites came to view these migrations. Again, on the one hand, you've got people who are of the opinion that the South is better off if black laborers or this large number of blacks migrated. But on the other, there are people who are a little more concerned about the loss of labor that these migrations are bringing about. And if you'd like to, just kind of go back at the very beginning of the slide and look at those numbers. In the first 2 decades of the migrations, you have close to 2 million blacks who are leaving the South for these jobs and for housing and for better conditions as they see it in the North. Now let's take a look at this process of migration and see if we can figure out what are the realities that we're looking at behind the advertisements that are trying to lure blacks to the North and the advertisements that are trying to keep them in the South. Were Southern blacks better off staying South or seeking new lifestyles in other parts of the country? We'll look at several things to figure this out. First, let's look at the process of the migrations. Migrants were the rural and urban poor, most of them were the rural and urban poor, as well as the better educated, more adventurous and ambitious. Generally, middle-class blacks in the South did not migrate because they had created tolerable spaces, as one historian described them, in Southern communities. So the who would be just about anybody, especially the rural poor, but least likely would be the middle class. Most migrants came from South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Louisiana, and Mississippi. There are essentially 3 migration lanes, which you may be able to see in the maps in the next 2 slides. But if not, you can see them in the links, a link that I'm going to provide to a wonderful website on migrations called In Motions, The African American Experience. There are some really, really good maps and stories and photos and everything. It's one of the best websites available for African American history. But getting back to what we were saying about the 3 migration lanes, people tend to migrate in a straight line. And these lines that we're looking at for the Great Migrations are for the most part vertical. So they're migrating from the southeast to the northeast, from the middle south to the middle west, from the old southwest going to the far west, and even the western part of the Midwest. These migration patterns are illustrated on the maps, as I said before. Most migrants had very little money. So if you're thinking in terms of how did they get there, and we'll talk about this a little later in just another slide, they generally use the cheapest routes, sometimes using the railroads and sometimes using other routes. And we're going to talk also about some gender variations in this process of migration. And let's take a look at the maps and see if we can follow these migration lanes and see where people are going to. Now on this map, if you look at the blue areas, those are the states that experience the greatest decrease in populations. And the pink areas, New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, all the way over to Oklahoma, those are the areas that experience the greatest increase in population. So if we look at just the areas that had the greatest decrease, we can look at particular sections of some states like Tennessee. You see very solid areas, a solid mass, for example, in Middle Tennessee, in the eastern and part of Tennessee and the western part of North Carolina. Solid area if you look very close to outside, just east of Memphis. But if you look even more generally, states that lost the most population were the southern Atlantic seaboard states. For example, the Carolinas, Georgia. The states of the upper and lower South, Kentucky and Tennessee, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and in the Trans-Mississippi region, across the Mississippi River, of course, Louisiana. There's some Gulf Coast areas of Texas, just little fringe areas around the coast of Texas, where there's a movement of population, but that's a movement more inland rather than outside of the state of Texas. In terms of states that increased in population, other than Florida, the states that gained population are in the Northeast, the Midwest, and the Trans-Mississippi River states of Arkansas and Oklahoma. And again, some sections in Texas, that east coastal area of Texas, where there's a movement inland. You should also notice the patterns of migration. If you can see the way those arrows are adjusting, you'll see what I mean by that vertical movement out of the Carolinas up into New York, into Pennsylvania, out of Alabama, for example, all the way up into Michigan, then out of, let's say, Mississippi and Louisiana into Chicago, and also into St. Louis. In this map, we see an even broader reach of these migrations because this is looking at the whole period of the migrations from 1915 to 1970. On this, you can see that they've divided the migrations into that Great Migration as they see it and extending it, as I said before, into that whole period of the 1930s. So from 1915 to 1930, the patterns are essentially what you saw on the previous map. And then the second migration, which they consider from 1940 to 1970, is the one that is taking blacks out of, let's say, Arkansas or Louisiana, all the way to the West Coast, to Seattle, to Portland, all the way down into Oakland and to Los Angeles. So the migrations, that second migration, let me just back up. The first migration is starting with World War I. That second migration is starting with World War II. Now, as I said before, there are gender variations to this migration. Single men generally work their way north, leaving farms for southern cities, like coming from Clarksdale, Mississippi to Memphis, doing odd jobs in these cities and sometimes staying in one location for a few years before proceeding to the next step of their migration, say from Memphis to Chicago, in a secondary migration. So there are actually two phases that they're migrating in. Women, on the other hand, were instrumental in convincing family members and friends to move north. Women also maintained ties to the families they left behind. They tended to migrate in a single trip, usually with a specific destination in mind, and kin networks were very often important in how they migrated. They usually took a train, say from Clarksdale to Chicago. Someone might meet them at the train station, so there's no secondary migration involved here. And much of this was the reason for this pattern was to limit this risk of sexual assault or violence. Memphis, for example, gets to be a really rough and tumble town in the early part of the 20th century. And many families from further south, from, say, parts of Mississippi, were very wary about their daughters coming to Memphis. So they're not looking to this secondary migration pattern that men are using. Man might come from Clarksdale to Memphis, work a year or two, then move on to Chicago. But if your daughter is saying, I'm going to come from Clarksdale to Memphis and I'm going to work a year or two, families would have to consider now, what kind of work is she going to do, coming from a rural background into this kind of fast-paced urban setting of Memphis, Tennessee, which was a pretty wide open city, especially around Beale Street in the early part of the 20th century. So again, the pattern of migration for women is a little different. Women also return south in greater numbers for periodic visits to their children or to participate in community celebrations or family reunions. or to attend religious revivals and funerals. Women were bringing elements of Southern culture, food, language, family patterns to northern streets as well. So you could imagine that, say in Chicago, those migrants from Clarksdale, Mississippi, who are ending up in Chicago are bringing those patterns of Mississippi life to the city. Even though women are making these trips back home more often than men, this absentee mothering that they're doing, leaving their children in the South to go north to work and to try to establish a home that they can bring the children to, made adjustments to life in the city, to their new homes, much more difficult. Now, this question of how did people get to the North? As I said before, most migrants had very little money, little extra money, and they used the most economical means to get to their destinations. Railroads sometimes gave special passes to their employees, so a Pullman porter might pass these special train tickets along to family members to help them move north. By the 1940s, many migrants, like the family that you see in this picture, were using the highways. They were, in effect, loading up all of their belongings, including, their children. This car is evidently packed to the hilt, and taken to the roadways to make that trip to the north. Once they got to the north, there is this question of how do they make the adjustments. Migrants faced situations that were very new and challenges that were very different from those that they had in the South. Their new neighbors very often, whether they were black or white, sometimes criticized the migrants for what they described as their country ways, or their speech patterns, or their behavior and the way they dressed. Probably the most crucial adaptation that they have to make is this concept of time, which we probably don't really think of as a major adjustment. But you have to remember that most of these people are coming from a rural background, where time is usually measured by rural rhythms, by the sun, by the weather. You get up and you're milking the cows at a certain time, but you don't need a clock to tell you this. But when you move to these urban areas and you're going to get a job in a factory or something, then the time or your calendar or your schedule is really determined by clocks or time cards or some kind of rigid calendar that is a little different from what you were accustomed to in your rural setting. Migrants were very often helped in making these transitions by groups like the Urban League or the YMCA or the YWCA or their churches. The Labor Department, the U.S. government Labor Department, created a division of Negro economics to help with this adjustment. Black newspapers offered advice on housing and on jobs, and indeed some migrants some people who were planning the migration often wrote to newspapers like the Chicago Defender for help even before they, in a sense, got on the road. Black organizations, particularly black women's clubs, also assisted the new migrants. When they got to the North, probably one of the most critical problems that they're having, or probably the two most critical problems that they're having to deal with, are residential patterns and jobs. And what we see happening here is that black migrants and European immigrants confronted the similar patterns of residential segregation in urban areas. People tended to settle near those with similar cultural characteristics, although for blacks, race was a factor. Urban centers were attracting large numbers of blacks, particularly to the industrial Midwest and to the east, industrial Midwest and east, or east of the Mississippi. If you look at the table on page 41, table 14.1 on page 354, this will give you some idea of how these populations in the urban centers are changing as a result of the migrations. You'll see some cities have these huge population increases between 1910 and 1930, sometimes more than 200 or 300% increases in populations in those 2 decades. In terms of economic life, blacks who moved north, contrary to what Southern newspapers had said, if we go back to that ad that we looked at, did find a rising standard of living when they moved to cities, whether it was rural blacks found this, when they moved to cities, whether it was the cities in the South like Nashville or Memphis or Atlanta, or whether it was cities and urban areas in the North. Their standard of living changed. Men found jobs in factories in the North. During World War I, they found jobs in the ammunition or the iron and steel products, producing iron and steel products, in meat packing, in the auto industry, in truck productions. They found jobs in the manufacture of electrical products or in shipbuilding and coal mining. Blacks also worked in the operation of the railroads and in communications. Wartime migration during the First World War was actually a portal or an opening into the industrial economy for many blacks. Many of them kept these jobs after the war ended because this kind of restriction or this limitation on immigration, European immigration, did not just end as of 1919, the end of the First World War. It continues into the 1920s. So blacks were able to continue this migration to find jobs in these urban areas in the North. For black women, job opportunities were a little more restricted. Many of them were still confined to the same kind of domestic work that they had done in the South. Although many had expected to find jobs like the men in northern factories, they often faced competition from white women who had these jobs, who refused to share industrial space like workrooms or toilets with black women. And we also have to remember that for women in general, industrial labor was much more restricted than for men, where you can see men working in all those kinds of industries that I mentioned earlier. For women, you're going to see probably for the most part that they're going to be confined to the textile industries, to the garment industries. Black women worked in hotels as cooks or waitresses and maids. They worked as ironers in the new steam laundries that were developing in urban areas north and south. They're also in many cities still working as washerwomen. So you've got those two different aspects of the same kind of industry. The steam laundry is the industrialized aspect, but the washerwoman who's still bending over a wash tub with a washboard is the more individualized entrepreneur, private entrepreneur in this same business. And black women are doing both levels of this. Black women also worked as labelers or stampers in mail order houses like Sears and Roebuck or Montgomery Ward, or as common laborers again in lampshade factories or garment factories. And they worked in food processing and meat packing plants. Any of these jobs, however, all of these jobs were generally low status jobs with long hours and low pay. Blacks also faced racial discrimination in urban areas. In addition to this competition for jobs that they're facing with whites in the northern areas, and eventually once European immigration picks up with the growing number of European immigrants as well, they also have to compete for space, living space in the cities. Whites were apprehensive about their new black neighbors. Housing becomes an issue. Jobs are an issue. There are cultural differences as well. And these conflicts or competitions over jobs and housing sometimes led to racial violence. You had race riots occurring in East St. Louis in Houston, in Chicago, Elaine, Arkansas, Tulsa, Oklahoma, Rosewood, Florida. On pages 346 to 347, there's a very good description of the scope and the character of these riots. The 1920s was a decade of violent cultural clashes. The Ku Klux Klan, which had been suppressed since the Reconstruction period, came alive again in 1915 and spread across the country. So this is an organization that is not just kind of centered in the southern states. The new Klan of the 20th century is much more widespread in its geographical focus, but also in the targets of its violence. Klan organizations targeted blacks, Jews, Catholics, immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, anybody that they considered to be different. The eugenics movement also added fuel to the racism of the early 20th century. Eugenics was the belief that racial characteristics indicated intellectual and social worth. And to some extent, it was a movement that tried to restrict the reproduction of people who were considered inferior. Your textbook author also notes on page 347 that this movement did not just center among some intellectuals or some just radical racists or whatever, that even the federal government seemed to legitimize the views of eugenics advocates in what they describe as this government printing office pamphlet called Defects Found in Drafted Men, which was published in 1920. African Americans were also targeted in the infamous Red Scare of 1919, as federal agents used obviously unconstitutional methods to search out, arrest, and deport hundreds of non-citizens. This movement began in the summer of 1919, and for African Americans, that summer of 1919 became known as the Red Summer because of some of the race riots of that period. You had lynchings of some black soldiers who were still in uniform. And these are in urban areas in the north as well as in southern cities. So this is a very difficult period when we're looking at this second decade of the 20th century and going into the 1920s. Things do not get much better. The Justice Department also investigated black periodicals like the NAACP's Crisis magazine and some socialist organizations that blacks had held membership in. Now, one of the things that you're going to be doing for this particular module is looking at part 3 of the rise and fall of Jim Crow. And they'll talk about how the NAACP organizes and begins to lead an anti-lynching campaign. They'll focus on Du Bois and the New Negro and what becomes known as the Fisk Crisis in 1925. Du Bois's Talented Tenth, we've already talked a little, or you've already looked a little, or heard a little bit about from some of the other videos. And they'll talk about what happens with tenant farmers and sharecroppers like Ned Cobb and this rising influence of the American Communist Party and socialism among African Americans. They'll take a look at this debate that emerges between Du Bois, W.B. Du Bois, and Walter White over the direction that the NAACP should take in the 1920s and into the 1930s. And this becomes a period when we'll see Du Bois leaving. Du Bois, of course, is the editor of the Crisis magazine, but this growing conflict and these growing questions will lead him to eventually leave the NAACP. The Great Migrations had a political impact as well as a cultural and a social impact. Probably one of the most obvious things that happens politically is that as larger numbers of blacks migrate to urban cities or to urban areas, and as they go to places where they can exercise the right to vote, number one is that blacks can and they do vote in these cities. They compete for political power with other groups. They learn how political machines operate in some of the bigger cities in the North, like Chicago or New York. They come to understand what political favors mean in the operation of these political machines. And most importantly, we begin to see the election of blacks to office, to political office. The last of the Reconstruction era African American representatives in Congress leaves office in 1909. There is not another African American representative in the House of Representatives until 1928, when Oscar DePriest is elected from a district in Chicago. He serves for 3 terms. Then he is followed by Arthur Mitchell, and I should make a correction in the dates. Arthur Mitchell is elected from this same Chicago district in 1934 and serves for 4 terms until 1942. Then he's followed, again from the same district, by William Dawson, who serves for 14 terms, elected in 1942 and serves until 1971. In New York, coming out of the Harlem area in New York, you have the election of Adam Clayton Powell in 1942. He serves 11 terms in the House of Representatives until, or 22 years, until 1966. Other developments as a result of this Great Migration include the Harlem Renaissance, and in your textbook there's a very interesting section on the Harlem Renaissance, and Marcus Garvey and the Universal Negro Improvement Association pay particular attention to who Garvey is and what are his goals, what is he asking for blacks to do, and also pay attention to the kind of relationships that develop between Garvey and other black leaders. Much of this will have to do, or the character of these relationships, will have to do with Garvey's background, that he is not from the United States, he's from Jamaica. He comes comes to America, believing, first of all, in the ideals of Booker T. Washington. He actually what motivates him to come to the U.S. is to hopefully get an audience or a visit with Booker T. Washington. But Washington dies in 1915 or 1916, about the same time that Garvey is coming here. Garvey sets up his organization, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, in Harlem, and he chooses Harlem because he recognizes that the Great Migrations have brought large numbers of African Americans into this kind of concentrated area of New York City. He also recognizes that if we look at Harlem, what we see is that there's this great renaissance developing in the 1920s in terms of this literate population being able to exercise its freedoms, and you have these great writers and singers and artists of the Harlem Renaissance. Garvey's movement, however, is very different from the other movements of the people like W.B. Du Bois, who have been pushing very hard for integration and the ability to assimilate into American society and to exercise their rights. Garvey's movement is very different. Garvey's movement centers on separatism or black nationalism. And he's promoting something that we've seen in the 19th century in terms of the American Colonization Society. What he's promoting is a Back to Africa movement, one that is centered on trying to get African Americans to go back to Africa physically, or if not physically, then at least to support African nations. And in particular, the nation Garvey focuses on is Liberia. So we'll do a little bit more with looking at this period of the first 2 decades of the 20th century in the discussions, in your readings, and then also in your quiz.